Hey everybody, it's me. I've been avoiding this, but it's time for us to have a frank discussion about the Second Amendment. So, um, I've been avoiding it because it's not a thing that I like to talk about because it's very polarizing. It's very dividing because Americans have strong feelings one way or the other about um, guns in general, and it's all rooted in the Second Amendment. So I'd like to have a talk with you guys about it and kind of let you know how I feel and what I think is the right thing to do. Um, the reason I'm talking about it now is obviously recent events. In the last 30 days in the United States, there have been 45 mass shootings. Um, that definition is four or more people shot, um, injured, or killed in the same place at the same time, not including the shooter. Doesn't have to be a public place. That's a broader definition. The FBI says three or more people, but it has to be a public place, so like the FedEx facility, the Las Vegas Strip, those things that we think of when we think of mass shootings. Um, so um, let's talk a little bit about the Second Amendment because that's kind of the heart of all of this. The Second Amendment reads this way: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There are four sections to this. The founders were kind enough to add commas between them, even though grammatically it looks silly. A well regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Let's look at each section of this and try to suss out what the founders were actually trying to do for us. So it's important to understand that at the time of the revolution, um, the 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 British Army was the strongest or one of the strongest fighting forces in the world at the time. They were coming off the high of defeating the French in the Seven Years' War. They were still recovering from that, but morale was relatively high in England, not necessarily among the army, because they had done this. But they needed money, and that's where the taxation came in, and that's the whole start of the whole root of the war. So one of the one of the problems was we didn't have an army. We were a colony. We were part of Britain, so their army was our army. How do you fight with your own army? And you can't really do that. So the the Continental Army was filled with mostly volunteers. The British army wasn't. Most of those people were conscripts or criminals or people forced into service for one reason or another, and so different mindsets from the beginning. But these were men who had guns because they had to provide for their family, um, and so they took their gun that they used to hunt and then they went to war with it. Most of they didn't really have an opportunity to buy guns. Who had they bought guns from? They couldn't make guns because all of the an interesting thing a lot of people don't realize there were no foundries in the United States at the time of the Revolution. All the iron ore had to be sent back to England to be smelt and or smelted. I don't know the past tense. I don't know what the proper word to use there. To go through the process of smelting to turn it into workable steel. Um, they had to go to England to do that, and that was because the people in England didn't want the 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 colonies to be able to outproduce them because of it was easier for them to get the raw materials needed to make iron and steel. And so those things had to go back to England to be made into the raw materials that you can make guns with. Now there were gunsmiths, but they had to get the material from England. And as you might imagine, once the war started, that was in short supply. Where were they getting it? So they started doing things illegally, and they started trying to buy weapons from other places like France. But France was broke. France had been in a war with the British and lost, and so they didn't have as much. And the Spanish weren't interested in getting involved because, and as far as they were concerned, things were ripe for the picking. If um, England lost this, it put them in a better position. So, but at the same time, they really didn't care. So people had their guns, and they took care of their guns because their guns were a means of putting food on the table, and that's so it was an important part of the aspect of the Continental Army. It was filled with volunteers, and there were small militias that were grouped together and become regiments and part of the regular Continental Army. Now, there were people who volunteered and were in the army and had weapons provided for them, but that was a very small number of people. Most of the people fighting the revolution provided their own weapons and provided we didn't have uniforms. There was no standardization of the force. That's one of the reasons why we won, because we had to use guerrilla warfare because that's all we had. These men weren't trained. There was no time to train. They would just go out and fight. So, because that was such a fundamental part of the foundation of the country, they knew that how important it was to be able to raise an army quickly without having a standing army that was large enough to deal with outside threats. So, they needed to have the ability for people to be called up into a militia that they could then regulate, that they would be under the command of regular army officers and NCOs who were trained, and then they could rouse the rabble, as it were, and get them into fighting shape to fight what they needed. That which is where the second part comes in, being necessary to the security of a free state. But a lot of people don't realize that there's a second kind of darker reason for that. The free state isn't just the country, the United States. The free state is also the states themselves. There was a real concern in 1789, 1790, 1791 that the federal government would do what the British government had, which is that that the president or the Congress would use the army to enforce its will. So the president wants to give part of Virginia to Maryland, and Virginia's like, screw you, bro, and Maryland's like, bring it on. And then the federal government comes in and uses troops to secure the land and force Virginia to do what it wants. Free the slaves. This was a discussion. Free the slaves. They were afraid that the federal government would come in and force them to give up their slaves or give up their land or do whatever. And so written into the Constitution was the protection that every state would have the right to build its own militia, and that it would be responsible for regulating them and maintaining them and making sure that they were ready to go. But the states didn't have the money to provide uniforms and weapons for these people. So in order for them to be able to call up this militia and to regulate this well-regulated militia, they had to have weapons, because there were no weapons to be had at that time. And they didn't know that was going to change. They believed that if the situation changed, that we would just change the Constitution. They never intended for the Constitution to be the sacrosanct document that was so important and so holy that we would never dare change it. We have 26 times, but they thought, is it 26? $27. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I feel silly now. There are actually 27. There are 27 amendments to the Constitution. And it was 1992. I mean, I was in high school. I didn't really care. So basically, the whole idea of the Constitution with that, it would be a living document, that it would change as times changed. I don't think that they realized what would happen. But that's another point for another second. So there was a real fear in the 1790s that the federal government would impose its will on the states, and the states would have a need to fight off federal troops. And that's what this was for. That's part of what this was for. There was also a real fear, a valid one, because you have to remember who was to the north? Canada. Who controlled Canada still? Great Britain. Who was to the south? Spain. And were we friendly with the Spanish? Not really. The British and the Spanish had a lot of competition, and while they didn't have a lot of open warfare, on the ocean there was lots of fighting and lots of not getting along. And so we were very concerned about our neighbors at the time, not to mention the indigenous people who were rightly pissed about us taking their shit. So there was a lot of need for there to be a militia to call up because they didn't have the ability to finance a permanent militia that people served in like we have today. See, we have today a thing called the National Guard. The National Guard of each state answers specifically to the governor of that state. And the governor of that state has to permit troops to be called up by the president or the secretary of the Army or the Air Force or whatever, to be used in combat situations. Governors can decline to allow their troops to be used in this way, although it's not very common. National Guard members, while they are part of the normal chain of command of the armed forces, and report, to, while they're active in an active role, being lent to the Army or the Air Force or whatever, reports to the president, they ultimately, their commander-in-chief is the governor of their state, and they exist to protect and serve the state. They train alongside the U.S. military, they bunk with them, they train with them, they learn everything that they learn, but they are for the state. They are not for the federal government to use unless it's a dire circumstance. The whole point of the National Guard was to prevent the federal government from using federal troops against the state. That was the whole point of it. And I'm not saying, let me rephrase that. The whole point of the militia, the state, the Second Amendment piece of this, I'm not saying the National Guard was founded to protect the states from the federal government. But that's what would happen. The federal government, if the federal government wanted to march the army into, wherever, the governor, so we wanted to take over Texas, the National Guard in Texas would come and they would boom, boom, boom. Right? Because you can't ask Billy Bob to do it because Billy Bob doesn't have a tank or a jet. Right? You yahoos. Third part. Right of the people to keep and bear arms. This is enshrined from England. It was a right in England at the time for people to own weapons of just about any kind. There's these stories about the British would come and take. They did not. The British did not come and take anybody's guns. That never happened, because you'd be sentencing people to die, like that. You couldn't come and take people's guns away. That never. That was nothing. That never occurred. Because guns were primarily used as a hunting resource, not as a fighting resource, despite the fact that they were being used in warfare. So they didn't feel a need to infringe upon that. And we took that right, that enshrinement, directly from the British. However, the British would take your guns away if you did certain things, like fought against them and lose. If you were a criminal, if you were a this or you were a that, they would limit what you could have and what you couldn't have. So that ties into shall not be infringed. Since the Second Amendment was written, lots of things. You sir, you madam, cannot own a nuclear weapon. That's a violation of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. And it is a violation because it doesn't tell us what arms means. It just doesn't. It's not defined. It's very vague. What it means is what it meant. So there are two views here. And what kicks my ass about this is that the people who are constitutional originalists, people who want to take the Constitution at its word, as it was written, don't want to take it as it was written in 1789. They want to take what was written in 1789 and apply it to today, even though there's no way that the founders could have thought about what that would mean in 2021. In 1789, what this meant is they expected men to have knives, maybe a sword, and certainly a hunting rifle of some kind. And if you were wealthy or you were previously an officer in the military or served on a naval vessel, you might have a handgun of some kind. That was it. You think anybody owned a cannon? No one owned a cannon. Cannon were expensive, and they were hard to produce, they were hard to maintain, they were hard to move around, and they were hard to have ammunition for. No one had a cannon but the army. The armies had cannons because they were great artillery, they were siege weapons. You would batter your enemy into submission with a cannon. You would blow through their ranks as they marched across the field by shooting cannons that would bounce across the landscape and blow people apart. But people didn't have those, right? And it would have been ridiculous for anyone to own a cannon at that time. Unless you had a fort, like, I own this fort and I will have a little cannon here. And that's fine, but like, it just wasn't a thing that people did. The guns that they had at the time were muzzle loading muskets, the flintlock, matchlock weapons that were slow to load, slow to refire. If you were a well-trained marksman, in rifleman in a military sense, you might get 3 to 4 shots off a minute if you were really good and really fast. If you were good, you could get 2. Most people were probably struggling to get 1.5 a minute because you're scared, you're under fire, there's people screaming all around you. And I got to tell you, this was the primary method of warfare well into. I just saw on Twitter today a Model 1841 Mississippi rifle. It is a percussion cap rifle. That's still a single shot rifle. Still a single shot muzzle loading rifle. Yes, you could probably get more shots off per minute, but maybe 4 or 5? Because you still had to load it in the top and you still had to put powder. The percussion cap was just to ignite the powder that you were putting in the muzzle. So, I mean, it's still a slow... And that's 50 years after this. 50 years, they're still muzzle loading their rifles, and that still continued into the Civil War. It wasn't until after... Now, they had advancements that happened during the time frame of the Civil War. It wasn't until after the Civil War that we started seeing guns that were easier to reload. We started seeing the increase in the use of cartridge-based ammunition that contained its own gunpowder. The percussion cap being included in the ammunition instead of being used, on the hammer, and rifles that were breech loading, that were loaded at the back instead of at the top, or loaded through a magazine through the bottom. It was a long time for those things to occur. I mean, 1880s, 1890s, before we started seeing these things being mass-produced. So, I mean, that's a big difference in time. And it's 100 years of development after this was written. Now, here's the thing. Yes, people still mostly use their guns for hunting. So, the part of shall not be infringed is connected to the part ahead of it, and no one wants to acknowledge that. No one wants to acknowledge that the whole reason they didn't want to take people's guns away or infringe on that right was because they wanted to be able to use those people to fight if they needed them to. Or they wanted the state to be able to use those people to fight if they needed them to. What they didn't expect to happen is that there'd be more guns than people. Guns were expensive. Guns were expensive. They had to be maintained. And it was a means of putting food on your table in 1790. Today, not so much. If you're hunting with an AR-15, you're hunting wrong. I don't know if you've seen what an AR-15 does to an object. It's not pretty. one of the things that you could survive a gunshot very easily in 1790, because it was more likely to graze you or embed in you than it was to actually go through you or to like cause some massive concussive explosion inside your body like today's weapons do. I'm not saying that they didn't die from other things. I'm saying that if you got shot with a model 1841 or an older musket, that you would have a higher rate of survival than they did. You absolutely would survive, more likely survive. Were the guns lethal? Yes, they were. They were always lethal. They've always been lethal. I'm saying that those guns were less lethal than the guns we have today. We need to fix this. If you're standing on the shoulders of the framers saying they want us to have machine guns, you're out of your mind. I want to remind you who the framers were. The framers were wealthy men who the whole reason that they were fighting is because their wealth was being taken away from them by the British. They weren't fighting for some altruistic notion of freedom for all men. That's not what they were fighting for. They were fighting to end a tax burden that they didn't want to pay. That's it, guys. There's your illusion of freedom. They didn't want, the very first time it came up that the federal government might be infringing on someone's freedoms, they sent the army in and squashed it. The Whiskey Rebellion. Look it up. They sent the army in and squashed it. That's why these things exist. That's why this exists. They didn't want the army to come in and just squash the states if the states decided that they weren't going to go along with what the federal government wanted. We don't have those problems today. We really don't. If you're afraid of your government and you think you need an AR-15 to protect you from the government coming to take your guns, you don't know how tanks and jets work. There, I said it. You underestimate the training and power of a well-trained soldier or Marine. You say you support the military and you're afraid of them. You're afraid that they would follow orders to fire upon citizenry for standing up for their First Amendment rights. Here's the problem. You don't want to stand up for my First Amendment rights. You want to stand up for your right to say hateful shit. You don't want your gun to protect or to protect yourself from the government. You're a coward and afraid of things, whatever those things are, whether it's people of color or whether it's the government or whether it's just feeling like you got a tiny pee-pee. You're afraid of these things and you feel like you have to have a gun to be secure. Guns don't make you secure. They make you less secure. And let me explain why. Most of the gun violence in this country is committed by guns that are legally owned. Yeah, chew on that. Almost all of the gun violence that happens in this country happens with guns that are legally owned. And usually, the shooter is the person who legally owns the gun. Not every time. And I'm not saying that people don't illegally own guns, because they do. The most common argument I get is that, well, people don't pay attention to the law. People will just keep their guns, and then I won't have my gun, and they'll have a gun, and they'll come and shoot me. Why? Are you being an asshole? Are you afraid they're going to come and take your stuff out of your house? You know what they're most likely to steal? Your fucking gun. Yes, that's what happens. That's how illegal guns get on the market. They come and they break in your house, they steal your guns. Because we are so obsessed with our guns, we refuse to secure them for fear we might need to use them. And then when we don't secure them, we also don't make them difficult to fire because we're afraid we might need to use them. Because every red-blooded American man has seen Rambo and thinks, this is my moment, or has seen Red Dawn and is waiting for commies to drop from the sky so they can go and get their Smith & Wesson out of the closet and go out and shoot Russians. This it's ridiculous. The fact of the matter is, yeah, it's your right. It's your right to have a gun. Every mass shooter in this country fired weapons that were procured legally. There, I said it. I'm not saying that they were the legal owner of the weapon. Dylann Roof was not the legal owner of the weapons he fired. His mother was. She didn't feel like she needed to secure her weapons around her mentally unstable autistic son, because that might infringe upon her rights. She might need that gun to scare off some scary brown people. I don't know. Mass shooters are law-abiding citizens until they aren't. A dear friend of mine was going through a nasty divorce. Her ex-husband decided he'd had enough, went to her house with an AR-15 and proceeded to shoot her to a nearly unrecognizable state. And then he killed himself with his kids in the house. He was a law-abiding gun owner until he wasn't. There's no background check that would prevented that. And I get that. We're not going to end all gun violence by stopping AR-15s or stopping certain kinds of things from happening. We're not going to put a complete and total stop to it. I understand that. What I'm saying is that, and I'm not saying he wouldn't have gone to the house and tried to kill her some other way. He may have. Guns, you're ignoring the fact that guns make it easier to kill people without having to be in their face. It is a coward's weapon. It's designed to kill people from a distance. So you don't have to be right up on them, and they can't get to you to hurt you. Like if I had a sword and we were fighting, you might hurt me. If we had knives and we were fighting, you might hurt me. With a gun, I can be over here. I can be all the way over there and shoot you from over there, and you can't get to me and you can't hurt me. It's a coward's weapon. I dare you to come and confront me with that. And tell me you're not a coward. Because if you own a gun, if you own a long gun to protect your home, you're a coward. A coward. It's what I have to protect my home. I'm going to say this, and I want you to listen to me and understand it. It is time for us to stop hiding behind something that was written for 1791, for guns that existed in 1791, and pretending like it's the goddamned Bible and that it can't be changed. It can. We just don't want to, because people are afraid of stupid shit. There's nothing to be afraid of. Oh, then the bad people will have all the guns. No, they won't, because we're going to incentivize them turning their guns in. Oh, then they'll beat me up, but you'll be alive. That's your choice. Yes, they took guns out of England. Violent crime still exists. They beat you up. They might stab you. Muggings still happen. Homebreakings still happen. Maybe even at a slightly higher rate, because they know that there's no gun in the house. But they're alive. Your stuff can be replaced. You can heal. You can get better. Someone shoots you with an AR-15, you're going to die. The likelihood of being shot with a high-powered semi-automatic rifle by someone with even a modicum of training is very slim. The guns do so much damage that even if you survive, you'll bear that wound for the rest of your life. Frodo, with the stabby in his shoulder, and he couldn't hardly move his arm forever and ever and ever. Yeah, that's going to be you. You're going to get shot in the shoulder, and it's going to destroy your shoulder. You may lose your arm. You'll still be alive, yes. But if someone stabs you in the shoulder, some stitches, a couple weeks recovery. Someone beats you up, you get some therapy. You get your stuff back. Insurance, replace all your stuff. Someone comes in and shoots you with a high-powered rifle, They're going to take your stuff anyway. That's your choice, guys. We don't need the guns. We don't need them. Your government is not coming to control you. You're an idiot if you think that the government is actually going to march through your town and force you to do things you don't want to do. And if you think for one hot second that you with your pea shooter is going to go out there and stop them with you and your drinking buddies, you're out of your goddamn minds. I don't care how well trained your militia is. You're gonna meet the 101st or the 82nd Airborne, and they're gonna walk all over you. And if you're gonna be like, well, they're on our side, they all no, they're gonna follow orders. And they're not going to let you hurt people because you're afraid. Because they took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States as it's written. And if that Constitution changes, they still have to defend it, whether you like it or not. And if they don't like that, they can leave. That's the great part about the military. You do your time and go. You can conscientiously object and end your contract. Right? I tell you right now, if they decide that they're going to turn their backs on it, they can spend a long time making little rocks out of big rocks at Leavenworth, because that's what happens to people who violate their oaths. So I'm here to tell you, you don't need to worry about the government coming, because if the government wanted to come and take your shit, they would. They just would. Like I said, you don't have a tank. You don't have an armored personnel carrier. And you may be like, well, I have a such and such and such and such. Yeah, you're a dude with that. You're going to kill the Marines that you claim to love and the soldiers that you claim to love and support because they're following orders to come and take your gun away? And they're not going to. I'm just saying, hypothetically, that's your scenario. It's not going to happen. They're not coming for your guns. They're just not. We need common sense legislation. And here's what you need to do. We need to treat guns like we treat cars. You need to register your gun. No choice. You have to register the fact that you own a firearm. I don't want the government tracking me. Do you drive a car, dude? Do you drive a car? Do you pay taxes? Because they already know everything about you. Register your fucking gun. I don't care where you got it. I don't care. You register it. And then you have to take a class. You have to take a class to prove that you know how to use the weapon safely. That you know how to secure the weapon safely. And that you know how not to let other people use the weapon when they're not supposed to. And once you've taken that class, then you have your little ID that shows that you're trained to carry, and then you can carry the weapon anywhere you want. Because you have an ID that shows me that you have taken, done, and whatever. And then you have to carry insurance. So that if you accidentally pull that gun out and shoot somebody that's not in danger of killing somebody else, or you use that gun inappropriately, you can pay for it. And you can cover those damages. If you accidentally kill somebody, your insurance covers that expense. And it's going to be expensive as fuck. But you know what? It's going to be worth it because you get to have a gun. There you go. Problem solved. But we're going to limit it to handguns. Because, well, handguns and 22 rifles. Because here's the thing. If you're hunting for food, you don't need more than that. You just don't. Because I'm here to tell you right now. 10,000 years ago, they were out there hunting shit that's bigger than your car with spears and bows and arrows. You don't need an AR-15. Take this to heart. Have a good weekend.